As part of the 23rd International Conference on New Directions in the Humanities, I will be exploring today the work of a French rapper named Younes and its links to immigrant identities in a presentation that I entitled Younes, Harraga, and Immigrant Subjectivities on Humanizing Immigrant Stories via Rap Music. On January 26, 2024, the French government passed a law to, and I quote, control immigration and improve integration, end of quote, which is nothing more than a politically correct way of saying that President Macron and the parliament voted in effect to harden the country's policy on unauthorized immigration with a special focus on asylum seekers and work authorizations. This law and the media discourses that it generated illustrate the common representations of immigration in France. A discourse focused on ideas of biopolitics, neoliberal capitalism, and on the usefulness or expandability of immigrant populations, echoed by the 2024 law and its specific clauses such as the facilitation of residence permits deliverance for hard jobs, i.e., jobs requiring more manpower than France can provide, or the hardening of the process to obtain nationality, family gathering, but as well as the suppression, of the state medical aid for undocumented individuals. This dehumanizing approach to immigrant bodies from the global south, understood as expendable commodities for the global north, is obviously not new and has permeated the French cultural landscape for decades now. The representation of migrants' identities have remained largely controlled by a media discourse at best neutral and at worst complicit in reinforcing voyeuristic and/or dehumanizing tropes, with the countless hours of video footage of migrant boats trying to reach the Spanish, French, or Italian shores on French news broadcast, depicting this population as a shapeless mass rather than a collection of subjective individuals, with the notable mediatization of the horrifying death of Alan Kurdi, a 2-year-old Syrian boy found dead on a Turkish beach in September 2015. This blind spot in the representation of migrant subjectivities has thankfully been taken over by artists internationally and their different cultural representations. From the riveting work of Chinese contemporary artist, documentarian, and activist Ai Weiwei with his controversial photographic reenactment of Alan Kurdi's death in 2016, as well as his 2017 documentary Human Flow, to the embodied performances of Patricia Nguyen, such as a Saltwater 2015 performance highlighting Vietnamese refugee subject formation. Art appears to be a German prism through which migrant subjectivities can be recovered. In the French cultural landscape, similar examples can be found in even more mainstream artistic productions, such as popular music. Against the commonly accepted national ethos of dissimulation of the dead migrant subjectivity, French singers and rappers alike have challenged this narrative by giving a voice to the voiceless. Such is the case of the French duo Madame Monsieur, who represented France at the 2018 Eurovision Song Contest, arguably the biggest musical event in Europe, with their song Mercy, inspired by the real story of a young girl named Mercy, who was born to Nigerian refugees on a boat on the Mediterranean Sea in the midst of the European migrant crisis. Or the French rapper Medine with his 2022 song Nasser about a fictive Sudanese migrant named Nasser and his journey from Sudan to Calais, largely inspired by the tragedy of November 21st, 2021, and the death of more than 33 migrants between France and the UK. With the same intention in mind, another French rapper decided to use his music to foreground these often discarded voices and express their subjectivities pre and during migration journey. With his 2022 song and music video Harraga, co-written with Algerian rapper Drif, French rapper of Algerian origin Younes provides a first-person narrative of a migration journey inspired by the real tragedy of Moussa Safir, who died at sea in 2011. This presentation will provide a textual analysis of the lyrics that will highlight the complexity of the rationale behind clandestine immigration, beyond tropes of financial precarity and a certain easiness to uproot oneself. Furthermore, a media and film analysis of the music video will complement and challenge the diegesis created by the lyrics through the foregrounding of recurring motifs and the shrewd use of camera movements and framing to complexify immigrant subjectivities. Through this transmedia analysis, this presentation aims at recentering immigration and immigrant stories and highlighting the complexity of their migration journey before they even make it, if they do, to their destination. So let's start with the lyrics. The title of the song, Harraga, immediately introduces the gist of the political message behind it, an Algerian Arabic neologism that refers to young adult migrants who decide to clandestinely leave the Maghreb towards Europe, usually on boats, in hope of a better life. Younes' title choice operates simultaneously two very important political moves. On the one hand, the choice of an Arabic word for a song interpreted in French and largely made for a French-speaking audience in France foregrounds a language that has been othered in France for decades by Islamophobic and racist propaganda and legal dispositions. On the other hand, the selection of Harraga as a word that specifically refers to migrants themselves recenters their subjectivities and initiates a self-narrative practice displayed in the lyrics all written in the first person. While the meaning of the word itself, harraga, may evade the understanding of a part of the French-speaking audience unaware of this practice, Younes' deliberate choice installs a specific connection between him and a specific subgroup of its French audience, either immigrants themselves or descendants of immigrants. A connection that is interestingly reinforced between the single and album version of the song, where the former starts with a 15-second instrumental intro, and the latter adds on top of this instrumental a voice message of one of Younes's cousins in French and Arabic, mentioning a recent Harraga event and Younes' song. This deviation from the French language, quote unquote, is nonetheless the only one in the song, as the entirety of the lyrics are in French across verses and choruses. The structure of the song itself is rather formulaic, with an introductory chorus made up of sang repetition of the word harraga, followed by a first verse, a pre-chorus, a chorus, a second verse, and a repetition of the pre-chorus and chorus, with finally two conclusive sentences. In the short time of the song, 3 minutes and 18 seconds, Younes retells the story of an unnamed first-person narrator and his journey of clandestine migration to supposedly France, which eventually leads to his death at sea. One of the main strengths of Younes's lyricism lies in his capacity to paint a multidimensional character that does not verse into commonly disseminated tropes of migrant bodies and stories present in mainstream French media. The first verse, introducing the character and his motivations for leaving Algeria behind, already turns the migration narrative on its head by starting not in the country of destination, but his home country. And I quote the song, J'habite à Arze, banlieue de Oran, c'est beau l'Algérie, mais ici c'est pourri, des barres d'immeubles délabrés, couleur vieux gris délavé, which loosely translates into English, I live in Arze, in Oran's suburbs. Algeria is beautiful, but here it sucks. Run-down building projects, old washed-off gray color. End of quote. This introduction paints a poor picture of Algeria and the narrator environment. Yet, at the same time, this description is quickly nuanced by the next lines that reads, La nuit avec mes amis, on rêve d'ailleurs, on refait la vie. Plutôt bon vivant, j'aime rigoler. Je connais tout le quartier me connaît. Je suis diplômé, mais j'ai pas de boulot. Or in English, at night with my friends, we dream of somewhere else. We reimagine our lives. Rather bon vivant. I like to laugh, and I know the whole neighborhood knows me, and I have a diploma, but I have no job. End of quote. The juxtaposition of this line with the introduction of the verse shows Younes' shrewd development in the song, challenging anti-immigration discourses anchored in fear of the migrant individual as inherently violent and educated, and not versing into miserabilism and stereotypical narratives about the socio-economic backgrounds of migrants. Our narrator in the song is well known and respected in his own community and country, a college graduate, and has a jovial and happy demeanor, a description that stands lightly as a way against the usual portrayal of migrants in France from Algeria or elsewhere. In a context of poor economic perspectives, the narrator then introduces the main reason of his migration journey, and I quote from the song, Avec ma famille, on vit dans un studio, j'aimerais leur offrir un avenir meilleur, un rêve qui me tient à cœur. Un soir, on s'est mis d'accord, avec mes gars, on s'est cotisé, pour payer le bâbord, ce sera le 3, à la nuit tombée, à la nuit du port. Which translates into English, My family and I, live in a studio. I'd like to offer them a better future, a dream that's close to my heart. One night we all agreed, my boys and I chipped in to pay the smuggler. It'll be on the 3rd at nightfall at the entrance of the harbor. End of quote. At the end of this verse, of this first verse, Younes provides a complex, nuanced introduction of a young, educated Algerian man who overall enjoys his life and situation, but aspires to more for not only himself, but his family. A portrayal that conflicts with the discourses of laziness and social benefits free order imposed on migrants in France. Besides, the tension between individuality and collectivity when it comes to migrant populations, developed here by Younes, deserves our attention. The already mentioned use of the first person, I or je in French, in the text participates unequivoc I'm so sorry, without any, doubt in a larger aspiration of individuation of a demographics oftentimes referred to and visually depicted as an inhuman collective mass. Yet, because of the emphasis of Algerian Arabo-Islamic culture on collectivity and social connections, the narrator, albeit presented as an individual, is at all times attached to other subjectivities, his friends, his family, his neighborhood. This reinsertion of a freshly introduced migrant subjectivity within a larger collective in his home space is nonetheless not to be confused or conflated with the systematic lumping of migrant bodies into a singular mass, oftentimes enhanced by photographs of groups of migrants on small boats relating the news. Here, Younes's project is drastically dissimilar, and this tension between the individual and the collective is here to further his larger project of humanizing immigrants and their stories. Younes not only gives depth to their character and journey, but reinscribes them in a complex system of social relations, oftentimes completely ignored by the global north, that would have its population thinking that uprooting oneself from one's home country is an easy task because of this very willful ignorance of affective roots and connections. The call to action, also anchored in community, with the mention of the smuggler paid collectively by the narrator and his friends at the end of the verse, is then cut short by the pre-chorus that reads Tu sais que la vie me donne pas grand-chose, j'attends rarement qu'elle me gratifie. Il n'y a qu'en m'éloignant de la misère que je peux la trouver magnifique. J'ai les yeux rivés vers le ciel, les étoiles font des graffitis. La dalle m'a poussé au départ, mais la mer a plus d'appétit. Which reads in English, you know that life doesn't give me much. I rarely wait for it to gratify me. It's only by moving away from misery that I can find it magnificent. I have my eyes fixed to the sky. The stars are drawing graffiti. Hunger pushed me to leave, but the sea has more appetite. End of quote. Against the strong realism displayed in the first verse, Younes here relies on a more poetic approach around his journey, as he reaffirms the magnificence of his homeland that he would appreciate even more from a distance, understands, free from for some of its limitation at least. Most importantly, he introduces the motive of a personified sea and its hungry waters that links the narrator's eventual demise to a larger economy of death caused by other Harraga across space and time. This motif will be highlighted in the video analyzed later. The pre-chorus, eventually repeated a second time with an overlay of the word sang in the introduction, provides a respite from the migration journey itself and allows the listener a poetic introspection into the narrator's affective rationale behind his desire to leave Algeria behind. The mix of these affective poetics with the realism displayed in the first verse only heightened the multidimensionality offered by Younes to the immigrant identity. Against the expository aspect of the first verse, the second verse, on the other hand, takes a much more action-oriented turn as the narrator details his migration journey and eventual death. To further the affective omnipresence introduced in the first verse, the narrator is here describing, his migration journey, does not refer once to the prospects he aspired to find once on the other side of the sea, but remains largely focused on the emotional reactions his family would experience after his departure. And I'm quoting from the song again. Je suis parti une nuit d'été, avec mes reilles on s'est endetté, et la famille, je ne veux pas l'inquiéter, donc j'ai rien dit et j'ai tout quitté. Ma mère croit que je dors chez ma sœur. En vérité, je vais rejoindre le passeur. J'ai préféré partir en douceur. which translates loosely in English, I left one summer night with my brothers. We went into debt. And the family, I don't want to worry them, so I said nothing and left everything. My mother thinks I'm sleeping at my sister's. In truth, I'm going to join the smuggler. I preferred to leave quietly. End of quote. The subsequent description of the beginning of the boat trip with a stormy sea, reinforcing the motif of water or sea as threatening and murderous, introduced in the first verse, and the insistence of the narrator to make the trip against the fear of the smuggler only foreshadows the inevitable doom he will eventually face. At this point of the verse, there is an interesting narrative shift where the listener does not get to know the death of the narrator through his own experience, but via a prolepsis or flash forward 2 weeks in the future when his mother receives a call from the police informing her of her son's death. And I'm quoting again. Un jour, enfin, le téléphone sonne et c'est mon prénom qui s'affiche sur le phone. Yema tremble, elle décroche, plein d'espoir. Elle a bien fait d'y croire, mais au bout du fil, c'est la police. On vient de retrouver le corps de son fils. Or in English, one day at last, the phone rings and it's my name on the display. Yema, which is the Arabic word for mother. Yema checks. She picks up the phone full of hope. She was right to believe, but on the other end of the line, it's the police. Her son's body has just been found. End of quote. This original take on the death of migrants at sea comes to replace the usually trivialized French media approach to these often commonplace events where migrants' bodies are just described as such, i.e. expendable units completely devoid of personal identities, subjectivities, and affective connections to larger social networks of family and friends. By recentering the country of departure across the entire song, Younes aptly shows that migrants make the decision to leave despite the danger of the sea, the complex uprooting from one's homeland and culture, and most importantly, the harrowing consequences their death have on the family and friends they leave behind, against the cold and emotionless coverage they receive on the other side of the sea. A project skillfully summarized in the two conclusive lines of the song, and I quote again, J'ai quitté ma famille, j'ai quitté mes amis, j'ai quitté ma ville, je suis monté à bord, j'ai pris le navire, j'ai perdu la vie. Or in English, I left my family, I left my friends, I left my town, I got on board, I got on the ship, I lost my life. End of quote. With these lyrics, Younes proposes an alternative narrative to a French audience largely and probably willfully unaware of the realities of these complex migration journeys and the persons who embark on them. To borrow the words of Jonathan Irvine in his work about political cinema in France, specifically about and around undocumented individuals, Younes Harraga is a perfect example of, and I quote, self-representation as a means of empowering communities and creating counter-hegemonic discourse as a response to the imbalances created by the coverage of mainstream media groups exterior to such communities, end of quote. Furthermore, the power of Younes' political message to recenter these marginalized voices and to create or recreate an untold history from below lies not only in his lyricism, but in the relationship between the diegesis he created and the accompanying music video he directed and at times, reinforces, complexifies, or challenges the fixed meanings of his words. The opening shot of the video offers a visual presentation of the literal meaning of Harraga, created from the Arabic word harag, meaning burn or those who burn, with a close-up on an open Algerian passport in the middle of a burning fire, and a slow and steady pull-out showing the passport burning to a crisp. This is a clear representation of the way migrant youth from the Maghreb will often burn their official documents before their migration journey as a way to symbolize their resolution and choice of no return. The next shot then introduces the narrator, played by Younes himself, in a close-up drone shot on his face while laying on a rooftop during the day. While the saying word Harraga resonates in the background, this drone shot eventually pulls out and adopts a bird's eye view in an overhead shot that includes the neighborhood beyond the rooftop, resulting in two effects. On the one hand, the overhead shot provides a more neutral point of view on the narrator body and individuality as compared to a nine-level shot that will reinforce a more voyeuristic approach and install a problematic power dynamic between the viewer and the character. On the other hand, the camera's pull-out movement that leads to this shot that moves smoothly away from the narrator's face formally highlights his isolation and emotional loneliness in the face of the decision he must make, something echoed by his facial expressions of discomfort and dread. This shot is part of a triptych that will shed light on the affective and life journey the narrator is going through during the entire song. The visual representation of the first verse both reinforces and challenges the narrative weaved by the lyrics analyzed earlier. The succession of shots of the narrator having fun in the back of a motorbike surrounded by lively and bright colors of side road vegetation, followed by night social activities in a hookah bar where laughter and smiles are complemented by warm lights and colors, both challenge the stern description of Algeria made at the beginning of the verse, but also echo the first verse's attention to social happiness and joy. This visual representation of joy is nevertheless cut short by the introduction of the migration plan at the end of the verse, which visually translates into the erasure of everyone but the narrator in the frame, sitting alone next to the hookah, looking to the side. This mid-shot slowly turns into a close-up on Younes's face via a camera push-in that draws the audience closer to the subject, enhancing the tension experienced by the narrator. This intimacy installed between the viewer and the character is strengthened by Younes's gaze, since at the very end of the close-up, he decides to turn his face towards the lens and looks directly at the audience. It is worth mentioning that behind Younes, a framed photograph of ocean waves introduces the water motif that will become more and more central in the video, whose gradual proximity to the narrator will eventually lead to his death. As previously mentioned, the pre-chorus and chorus operate a narrative pause when the diegesis comes to a halt and introduces an introspection into the narrator's psyche and emotional turmoil vis-a-vis his migration journey. On screen, this lyrical pause is nevertheless challenged by the depiction of the narrator and his friends in the back of a truck on their way to the beach to get on the boat. This visual representation of the lyrics then complexifies the apparent lack of action by adding an extra step into the migration narrative otherwise overlooked in the text. Nevertheless, text and visual media do work in tandem, as the poetics deployed by Younes in this part of the song, explained earlier, are met with far more visual experimentation, such as the use of slow-motion shots to depict the narrator in the truck, and most importantly, a shot of the narrator laying down on the beach next to a fire that mimicked the opening shot of the video, a drone shot that turns into an aerial shot from a close-up on Younes's face to a pull-out movement that decenters him to the top of the frame and slowly introduces his friend actively getting on the boat to the sea, with the eruption of the seawater at the bottom of the frame that poetically coincides with the line mentioned before, and I quote, "The sea has more appetite," end of quote. The visual depiction of the second verse remains faithful to its textual counterpart, with a focus on action and the journey itself, with shots reenacting the disagreement with the smuggler and the beginning of the journey on the sea at night. The final shot, a slow-motion mid-shot of Younes surrounded by his friend on the boat in the dead of the night, will be the last image of Younes after his departure. Following this shot, the music video then operates one of the most important fractures, and temporal one, with the lyrical context of the song. While the text relies on a prolepsis, or a flash forward, to jump to the discovery of the narrator's death, the video proposes a visual analysis or flashback of Younes still at his family house, happy and playing outside, followed by a succession of close-ups of his family members, alternating one by one, centered in the frame, looking and smiling directly at the camera lens. The lyrical pessimism of the lyrics that paints the family's weight and expectation as futile is thus nuanced by the superimposition with the display of joy and memories that bridge past remembrance with future possibilities. This renewed shimmer of hope allowed by the video is nevertheless cut short, both visually and lyrically, by the division in two distinct parts of the line, "On the phone, pose, it's the police, our son's body has been found," end of quote. This lyrical division, generating a space of discomfort for the audience compared to the fluidity of the song, is visually accompanied by images of crushing waves, whose uproar takes over the entire soundscape of the video, quickly followed by the images of the narrator's family at a creek, with the mother screaming and crying after hearing the news delivered by the line I just mentioned earlier, and I quote, "A son's body has been found," end of quote. In the end, through the temporal discrepancy between the text and the visual, and the decision to artificially divide specific lines in the text and fill the gap with heavily saturated affective representations, Younes succeeds in heightening the tragedy of the migration journey and possibly induces a stronger affective reaction and empathy from his audience. Finally, the last pre-chorus calls back to the intro of the video and the shot of the beach in the middle of the song. This time, the narrator's dead body, is displayed eyes open on the shores with waves submerging him, and just like the first two iterations of this shot, the aerial shot, allowed by the camera pull-out, reveals the other bodies dead around him on the beach. Yet, while the first two iterations of this shot eventually decenters the narrator in the frame, at the bottom from the first one or at the top for the second one, here, this last shot of a dead Younes keeps the body in the center of the frame while putting out, as if to force the audience to engage affectively and critically with this outcome. This strategic reproduction of the same shot, relying on similar initial framings and camera movements, visually participates in the multidimensional portrayal of a migrant subjectivity initiated by the lyrics. While the decentering of the first two shots alludes to the possibility of escape or other alternative the narrator could take, the last shot reinforces the inevitability and inescapability of death experienced by youth from the Maghreb, whose lack of prospect in their home country seem to outweigh the risk of their tragic demise. To briefly conclude, as a politically engaged rapper and artist, Younes does not shy away in his song Harraga to lend his voice and his platform to this part of Maghrebi youth who would rather leave everything behind, their family, friends, own identity by burning their passport, to find better prospects in the global north. Unlike the typical portrayals and discourses surrounding these clandestine migration journeys in France that tend to dehumanize migrants by grouping their individualities into collective lumps of bodies and experiences, by stripping them from their affective subjectivities and social networks via discourses of desirability or expandability, Younes decides to recenter the migrant's voice itself and addresses all the blind spots willfully ignored in the global north to fully give them back their emotional complexity and multidimensional subjectivities. The association of the lyrics and the video with their intense focus on subjective affect from not only the narrator but his family participates in Younes' larger project of rehumanization of the migrant identity in hopes of redrawing the contours of immigration narratives in the global north and challenging a French audience to empathize with rather than demonize this demographic. Thank you for bearing with me along this presentation. Feel free to comment and ask any question. I will be more than happy to answer any of them. Thank you.